Okay, well, I guess I'm just going to go ahead and start. So I'm Dr. Courtney Cassand. I'm an associate professor of history at Southeast Missouri State University. I'm also the program coordinator for the secondary social studies education program. So my advisees are tomorrow's history teachers. So it's been fun to merge those two interests. I'm in my 7th year here. So I published an article a few years ago about rural women's access to birth control in the 1920s and 30s. And Sarah Egg was the co-editor of that journal. So that's how we know each other. And I was just really excited to receive the invitation to join this conference and to moderate this panel. So welcome to the gender panel. Today we're going to hear from 4 talented historians who share their research about topics specific to gender and sexuality. Did you mean to mute me, Samantha? Oh.
Sorry about that. We're admitting people to the room and it moved. Sorry.
Okay, well, if you're just joining us, welcome to the gender panel. Each presenter will have 15 minutes to read their paper, so we're going to move pretty quickly. If you're presenting, I'm going to send you a private chat when you've got 5 minutes left. Don't worry if you can't monitor that along with everything else, but that might help you kind of reach your conclusion in a timely manner. If you have questions or comments, please put them in the chat and we will save time at the end to review those. And presenters can also post links and resources in the chat to share with the group, okay? So with that, I'd like to start with Anne Vlock. Anne is a PhD candidate at the University of Nebraska who specializes in 19th century reform movements, especially women's involvement in the American populist movement of the 1880s and 1890s. Her research on Nebraska reformer Luna Kelly was published in the Great Plains Quarterly last summer. And in the paper we're going to hear about today, Anne continues her explorations of women reformers in the late 19th century. Take it away, Anne.
Hello, welcome everybody. So built on a rich genealogy of 19th century reform thought, the People's Party of the 1890s mounted what was perhaps the most significant challenge to two-party domination in American history. Organized in Omaha, Nebraska on July 4th, 1892, the People's Party was formed from the Farmers Alliance, the Knights of Labor, and other allied reform organizations. But let's go to Stromsburg, Nebraska, where reform editor Isaac Chamberlain was in the process of selling his newspaper, The Headlight. He was moving to Colorado to take over a reform paper there. So in October 1892, he introduced the new publisher, his friend, an area resident, Jacob Coleman, and he introduced the new editor as Ada Coleman, Jacob's daughter. But in reality, Jacob was never the publisher. His daughter, Ada, was both publisher and editor and was assisted by her younger sister, Chatty. So at age 24, and after a year of teaching, Ada wanted to learn newspaper publishing, which she and her family knew absolutely nothing about. She was also following her example, the example of her father, who was heavily involved in the People's Party, and her uncle, who had been elected on the Union Labor ticket to the Nebraska legislature in 1888. She saw herself as a working woman who promoted populist reform embodied in the Omaha platform. In addition, she and her sister wanted to take on more of the family's financial support as they saw that a lifetime of farming had taken its toll on their father's health. So I utilize Ada Coleman's narrative in 2 major ways. First of all, I want to focus on justice to her forgotten voice. Because her reform career was cut short by a disability, possibly related to her eyesight around 1898, and because Chatty ran the newspaper successfully for 50 plus years after Ada stepped down as editor, Chatty is known as the woman who succeeded in a male-dominated profession. I point out that Chatty's success was built on Ada's advocacy of reform. And I also note that Ada, I do not seek to minimize their partnership nor downplay Chatty's accomplishments, but just to provide justice to Ada's forgotten voice. Second, I utilize Ada Coleman's narrative to argue for a much needed correction to populist historiography, which is mainly focused on a few women like Mary Elizabeth Lease and Sarah Emery, women who gained prominence at the national level through their oratory and nationally known publications. I argue that we need to utilize a larger set of women so that we can propose and test theories and trends with more confidence. And so I propose to add the voices of women journalists and editors who materialized mostly in the 1890s at the community levels in the areas of populist support and strength, most of which have been heretofore unstudied. They were, by the very nature of their jobs, influential in their communities. So I focus on this critical dimension of women's progress, that of their movement into leadership through journalism. I see their move into journalism as part of a process of male sharing of knowledge and power, but also of women taking the initiative. And my methodology involves tracing their networks. So Nebraska reform historiography has been content with adding reformer and Alliance State Secretary Luna Kelly as the Nebraska equivalent of Lise. But I'd like to point out that Ada Coleman and other women editors in Nebraska and the Great Plains are what I call hiding in plain sight in 1890s newspapers. Ada Coleman's first lessons in reform leadership came from within her own family and community, some of which I've already mentioned. But so briefly, Ada was born in 1868 in Illinois, her sister Chatty in 1871. Their mother died when they were young girls. Their father was a farmer and a Union veteran. The extended Coleman family migrated first from Illinois to Iowa and then to Stromsburg, Nebraska around 1880. So besides her family network, the other networks I focus on in my research are the Reform Press, the Industrial Legion, and the Stromsburg Women's Club. But unfortunately, I can't really go into a lot of detail about each of those networks, but I would like to mention some key people from several of them. So first, some brief chronology. So we have Ada as publisher and editor from 1892 to around 1898. In late summer 1894, she became a state officer in the Industrial Legion as state secretary. And just to put context to that, the Legion was a support organization set up by the People's Party that was to mobilize mass support for People's Party candidates. And so as for Reform Press meetings, Ada was able to attend three, the one in 1893, in 1894, and 1897. So besides her father, two key male members were Isaac Chamberlain and James Eggerton. In 1892, Isaac Chamberlain, who sold her the newspaper, was also president of the Nebraska Reform Press. So he undoubtedly encouraged Ada to attend the next Reform Press meeting, which she did. And the extended Eggerton family also settled in the Stromsburg area. He became president following Chamberlain in 1893 at the meeting she attended. And he was also the secretary of the State Central Committee of the Nebraska People's Party. And more importantly, he was also the National Secretary General of the Industrial Legion. So he, along with Legion head Paul Vandervoort, called the meeting that officially organized the Nebraska State Legion. So I'd like to also mention three women editors that are revealed by Ada's network. First, Mary Elizabeth Bowser, who published a reform newspaper from 1890 to 1895 in Newport, Nebraska. And she was appointed by Nebraska populist Governor Silas Holcomb as superintendent of the Norfolk State Asylum for 3 years. And then we have Celestia Woods, who was at the 1894 Reform Press meeting with her husband G.W., but they each represented different publications from the Adams County, Nebraska area. Unfortunately, this is going to be a slimmer lead to follow because neither paper appears to have survived in the archives. And then although Jenny Sheldon of the Shadron Signal was not at any of these Reform Press meetings, I trace her through Addison Sheldon, who did attend the 1897 Reform Press meeting that Ada was at. So I would really like to tell you more about Ada herself, but in the interest of time, I kind of need to skip forward to some of my conclusions that relate her narrative to the theories about women's participation in the populist movement, because I think that's real important. So social historian Robert McMath says that the height of women's participation in this reform movement happened in the early nonpartisan phase of the movement, which generally means before 1892. McMath does not footnote his narrative. He published a bibliographic essay instead, which for women, he cites a total of 5 sources altogether. So it's kind of difficult to figure out what he bases his generalization on and what his measure of high point is. So in contrast, Jeffrey Osler, he wrote Prairie Populism and focuses mainly on Kansas, Nebraska, and Iowa. He theorizes that the height of women's participation happened as women were able to utilize openings created in the alliance in the early to mid 1890s, openings that were created by men who tended to flock to the New People's Party hierarchy instead of the alliance. And he does base this on membership numbers drawn from several Nebraska locations. So my research, I would like to nuance Osler's theory as well as to add the concept of leadership roles to it. And I do agree with Osler that the height of women's experience tended to occur in the 1890s, not as McMath claims in the movement's nonpartisan phase. I measure this by the increase of women moving into leadership positions within the movement, especially the number of women entering newspaper editing and writing. So Osler's explanation tends to rely on openings for women in the alliance based on shifting institutional factors. I also point out that there are other explanations for why women's participation may have been higher in the 1890s and earlier. You know, sometimes it just comes down to individual circumstances. For example, Luna Kelly delayed her entrance into the alliance for 8 years after her father and husband joined. She was busy with young children. There were some other reasons also. And for Ada Coleman, around 1892, she was just entering young adulthood, was trying to figure out what she was doing. And so her entrance into the reform movement had more to do with her coming of age. In looking at Ada's leadership within the Industrial Legion, she appears to be the only state officer in the Legion hierarchy across all states that organized the Legion. 2 other women were named as national officers, Annie Diggs and Marion Todd. Creating a new reform organization would seem to present new opportunities for women, especially with this reform movement that overall has the reputation of welcoming women. But Ada, as the only state official, does point to a kind of a certain closing off of opportunities within the political party hierarchy itself. In contrast, at least 5 women around this time served as state officers in the alliance in Nebraska and Kansas, as Ada Coleman did as state secretary of the Legion. So even as the creation of the People's Party had a deflating effect on women moving into the party hierarchy itself, my database of around 15 and growing women journalists and editors indicates that they sought and found other avenues to exercise influence, with journalism as an especially viable avenue. And like men, they often utilize journalism as springboards into other positions of influence. Ada Coleman certainly did so, as well as Mary Elizabeth Bowser, who became superintendent of the Norfolk State Asylum. But you know, I really don't want to portray an overly rosy picture of women moving into leadership positions. Certainly in no area, journalism or patronage jobs, did women even begin to approach the percent of leadership positions with their percent of participation in the reform movement itself, which has been estimated at around 20 to 30% overall. But first of all, I would point out that Ada's experience contributed to the longer term success of her sister and served as an example to other women in later decades. I will also point out that results on the local level matter. In Ada Coleman's Polk County, the continuous and successful operation of the Headlight kept reform topics before the county electorate, and these voters did consistently fill county offices with reform candidates from 1886 through the 1890s. And one of the consistent threads of populist reform focuses on the election of honest officials. Ada Coleman also often expressed gratitude that a more conscientious core of local officials were filling county offices. No doubt she also wanted the reform results to be replicated on a larger level, but these were important results on a local level, and Ada did point to these with satisfaction. So Thank you for your time.
Good job, Anne. Thank you so much. It's so interesting. I jotted down several questions that I have if we have time at the end. So I'd like to follow up with those. Okay, but in the interest of time, we're going to move right along to Dr. Justin Carroll. Dr. Carroll is an associate professor of American history at Indiana University East and chair of the History and Philosophy Department. He is the author of The Merchant John Askin, Furs and Empire at British Native American term that I can't pronounce. Justin is presently finishing a short sequential art comic exploring settler and colonialism history, and currently is a fellow at the Newberry Library in Chicago, where he is working on the project we will hear about today, and I'm sure he will pronounce all the terms flawlessly. Welcome, Justin.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for being here. Andrew Jackson's partisans used the 19th century Indian office to attack President John Quincy Adams before the election of 1828. Thomas L. McKinney, the superintendent of Indian affairs, felt the heat. During his tenure in office, McKinney had proved to be a fierce proponent of the US's civilization policy. He collaborated with Protestant missionaries and clashed with fur trade barons like John Jacob Astor in an effort to transform the indigenous village world of the Great Lakes, Ohio Valley, and beyond into a landscape of small, commercially oriented Christian male-led family farms. He had now become a campaign issue. McKinney's long career in the government proved a happy boon for detractors. The pro-Jackson press scoured McKinney's travel narratives for evidence that he overcharged the government, used official diplomatic trips to campaign for Adams. While in Congress, the House Committee on Retrenchment, which looked for ways to trim governmental expenses, but also to highlight the waste and mismanagement of the Adams administration, criticized McKinney's use of public funds to support visiting Indigenous delegations to the Capitol. Congressional representatives from the Midwest railed against taxpayer-funded Indian portrait galleries at the War Department, and McKinney defended himself vigorously in print, in private, and before Congress. In this hyper-partisan context, McKinney first told the story of an Ojibwe woman named Chusick in May of 1828 in a public letter. Later in 1836, he would tell through the writings of author James Hall, Chusick's story once again in the very first volume of the seminal History of the Indian Tribes of North America. The basic telling of this woman's story, of Chusick's story, went like this. In January of 1827, in the cold of winter, Chusick came to McKinney's Georgetown home. After being warmed and fed, she claimed that her husband had died, and a dream directed her to Washington, D.C. to convert to Christianity and to put herself under the protection of the First Lady, Louisa Adams. She walked from Mackinac Island, down through New York, and into the Federal District. And McKinney quizzed her closely. She told him about serving in the households of George Boyd, the Mackinac Island Indian agent, the First Lady's brother-in-law, and in the household of Lewis Cass, Michigan's territorial governor. She offered very specific details of their home. And over the next week, Chusick became the toast of Washington high society. She was baptized, met with the First Lady, sat for an official portrait, and attended balls. Loaded with gifts, she returned to the Great Lakes. Soon after, a letter came to McKinney from Cass in Detroit, and it turned out that Chusick was a fraud. Her husband, a French stallion in the Boyd household, was very much alive, and she had apparently been traveling across the Midwest and into Canada doing similar things and telling similar stories. These two narratives of Chusick's story served primarily to burnish reputations. In the 1828 public letter, for example, her story showed McKinney to be a compassionate, able administrator of the Indian office, despite what his numerous critics said. He offered her the honors visiting Indigenous delegations normally received when in Washington, D.C. These honors were hardly frivolous, McKinney argued, but rather reflected the power and generosity of the United States towards its Indian children. The later 1836 narrative written by Hall dwelt more on Cass's letter and Chusick's perfidy. That account ended by relegating Chusick to a mere historical curiosity, denying her any pretense of being, quote, a touching incident in the history of women, end quote. Instead, her treatment in this narrative reflected, quote, actually reflected, quote, the benign character of our government and the ease at which the highest functionaries may be approached by any who would have ever a shadow of need of protection, end quote. Subsequent historians have treated Chusick no better. And I think this lack of critical engagement with Chusick is quite unfortunate. I think her story, properly contextualized and understood within an ethno-historical approach, one that tries to understand her actions and motivations in the context and worldview of an Ojibwe woman, I think opens a fascinating window into the fur trade society of Mackinac Island and the processes of Americanization taking place in the Great Lakes in the early 19th century. In fact, I'm gonna link a link in the chat function if you want to see who this woman is. There's a painting by Charles Bird King. In fact, it's a lithograph of a painting by Charles Bird King. The original painting burned in the Smithsonian in the 1860s. There's a painting of her by Charles Bird King, a well-regarded Washington, D.C. portrait artist. And I think this painting offers an entry point for how Chusick's journey might be better understood and better contextualized. In this portrait, one of many that he painted for the Indian office in the 1820s and 1830s, she sits erect with an arm resting on a table. She has a slight smile on her lips. A piece of metal lays across her chest. She's resplendent, the very portrait of the stereotypical Indian princess of popular American imagination in the early 19th century. A popular American imagination, as historian Rayna Green wrote, that made it, quote, impossible for Indian women to be seen as real, end quote, or even provide American observers with the proper lenses from which to view them as multifaceted people. In fact, the pro-Jackson press routinely referred to Chusick mockingly as the princess or McKinney's princess and other kind of aspersions. The Chusick received the cloth and material featured in this painting from McKinney, and in the privacy of her room in Holtzman's Tavern in Georgetown, she shaped her dress, quote, after the fashion of her people, end quote. Here in both narratives, the reader witnesses a moment of Chusick shaping her own appearance and controlling her own presentation. In the painting, the viewer sees Chusick as, in some ways, as she wished to be seen, as an Ojibwe woman deeply connected to the material culture of the Great Lakes Fur Trade Society. And this is quite illustrative. As historian Susan Sleeper Smith has recently noted, quote, women not only processed all the furs for the fur trade, but created new styles of clothing. They perfected existing designs and redesigned and embellished the manufactured European clothing that came into their household. The revolution in native dress placed women at the center of the fur trade, enhancing their authority. And for Chusick, her clothing was a potent symbol of her identity. It was a symbol of aspiration as well. As the wife of a French scullion, with her labor as a domestic servant, the portrait painted by King is deeply incongruent. Chusick's self-presentation did not match her lived reality. At Mackinac Island, Chusick would have served elite American families. In the Boyd household, for example, she encountered the authority of the US government. She served wealthy French traders, newly arrived American merchants, and most notably, she engaged with elite Indigenous and Métis women like Agatha Biddle. These women and women like them directed the fur trade, sometimes with their husbands, but often apart from them, serving as cross-cultural intermediaries or fur trade matriarchs who centered large and dynamic networks of kin. Letters and diaries and travel narratives during the 1820s highlight the importance in the day-to-day life of these women in Mackinac Island. Even when Euro-American observers fail to mention Indigenous women specifically or Métis women specifically, they often described in their narratives the social, political, economic, and environmental landscapes these women maintained. For example, fruit orchards, maple sugar, wild rice, corn, and the production of furs. Chusick grew up and operated in a context of powerful and influential Métis women. For example, about her daily tasks, Chusick would have encountered the household of Agatha Biddle, which during this period served as a focal point for the island's community and the larger French, Indian, and American fur trade society in the early 19th century. Agatha Biddle was a Métis woman, and reports tell us that at her wedding to the American Edward Biddle, she dressed like an Odawa fur trade matriarch. and her extensive kinship ties to the French and Indian communities of the Upper Great Lakes actually ensured their continued success and centered their longevity into the 1850s and 1860s. Agatha Biddle served as an Odawa emissary during the 1855 Treaty of Detroit negotiation. And she was renowned, like many Ojibwe and women and Métis women during this period, for her community building and charity work. Far from a fraud, Chusek's journey to Washington, D.C. centered on achieving reputation, authority, and approbation in the Great Lakes. Men like McKinney and Cass misunderstood her context and the larger implications of her journey. Chusek left D.C. with gifts, clothing, medals, and money. She met the first family, generals, ambassadors, set for a painting. These were all tangible markers of status frequently bestowed upon the principal chiefs, headmen, and warriors and delegations of vital Indigenous communities in the Great Lakes, Ohio Valley, and beyond. Despite taking place in Euro-American capitals in Washington, D.C., these encounters were often places where Indigenous notions of diplomacy held sway. Gifts and the language of kinship solemnized these occasions. They cemented ties and refreshed obligations. Men like McKinney gave out peace medals, flags, military commissions, and other symbols of Euro-American authority and approbation. Medals, for example, like the one Chusek wears in her portrait, they were important. They served to identify the wearer as elite members within their community. But they also highlighted their connection to a larger and influential power source abroad. Of all the paintings in McKinney's and Hawes' history of the Indian tribes of North America, very few of the paintings are actually of women. And of all the paintings, of the women, only Chusek is wearing a peace medal. There's another incident highlighted in Waban, the early days in the Northwest, by Juliet Kinsey, the wife of an Indian agent at Fort Winnebago on the confluence of the Fox and Wisconsin rivers, that I think offers an interesting anecdote about the transformative power visiting Washington, D.C. might have had for certain Indigenous women. In the 19th century, Kinsey described meeting the wife of Yellow Thunder, a Ho-Chunk chief, who had traveled to the Capitol and met the president. Quote, "From that time forth, Yellow Thunder's wife had been known as Washington Woman," end quote. The description of Washington Woman is interesting in that Kinsey failed to provide, despite consistently providing phonetic renderings of Indigenous names throughout her narrative, Washington Woman's name. It's possible that Kinsey never learned it, but I think it suggests the degree to which visiting Washington could come to inhabit a new identity for these women. To summarize, at the end of Paul's narrative of Chusek's life, he informs the reader, quote, "Chusek is well known on the frontier, but yet when we last heard of her, passed under a different name from which we recorded. Who did she become? At this point in my research, I don't know. But so far, I think Chusek's story reveals the ways in which she appropriated the expectations of American society, as expressed through its Indian policy, paternalism, domesticity, and Christianity, and used them to fashion herself literally and figuratively anew. The history of Chusek tells a unique story about the Great Lakes. By engaging issues relevant to her experiences, class divisions, wage labor, servitude, poverty, and what happens when market capitalism and settler colonialism alienated Indigenous people from their kin and communities, Chusek's journey to Washington, D.C. shows us the limits, horizons, and aspirations of sometimes marginal women and the paths they took towards self-possession. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Dr. Carroll. That was very, very interesting. I have questions for you as well, so hopefully we'll have time to get to those. I appreciate you sharing your research with us. Moving right along, Daniel Sunshine, who just shared the link to his Google Drive. He's posted his resources there if you are interested in looking at those. Daniel Sunshine is a PhD candidate at the University of Virginia, currently finishing a dissertation on West Virginia statehood. His project explores the themes of Union political culture, the expansion of democracy, and emancipation. In this paper, Daniel tells the riveting story of Lucy Bagby and how newspaper coverage of her escape and re-enslavement provide insight into how people in mid-19th century America thought about gender and race. Take it away, Mr. Sunshine.
Thanks so much. So yeah, I'd like to discuss Lucy Bagby. And she is an enslaved woman who became national news in early 1861 during the secession crisis. And she's the last in this chain of sort of big political fugitive slave cases, or not necessarily cases, but think Henry Box Brown or Anthony Burns. And quick caveat, the story is far more complex than I can give justice to in 15 minutes. But in the age of Zoom, I definitely agree that brevity is a virtue. So yeah, I'd like to focus on the Northern press after I give you a brief introduction to Bagby, because it's bizarre. They're sympathetic to her. They identify her as the victim, but they're also antagonistic and engaged in some character assassination. So again, also with the slideshow, please feel free to go through at your leisure. I'll reference it, but it's not critical. So Lucy Bagby was born in Eastern Virginia, most likely in 1837. In 1852, a Richmond slave trader named Robert Loy sold the 15-year-old girl to John Goshorn, a very wealthy merchant from Wheeling. You can see the bill of sale in the PowerPoint. Lucy's life, labor, and progeny changed hands for $600. She traveled with John back to Northwestern Virginia, where she joined 5 other people enslaved by the Goshorn family. Now, she had been transported tantalizingly close to freedom. Wheeling shared a border along the Ohio River with the Free State of Ohio, and 10 miles to the east lay the Free State of Pennsylvania. But she was no less enslaved in Wheeling than she had been in Richmond. In 1857, John Goshorn gave Lucy as a gift to his middle-aged son named William, and this was a common practice among wealthier slaveholders. But these changes in ownership often prompted enslaved people to flee. Whatever modicum of stability an enslaved person had been able to carve out under the previous master would have to be renegotiated with the new. And as Lucy would later testify, she found the younger Goshorn a cruel man. She probably began planning her escape soon after being given to William. And in October of 1860, he traveled out of the state, giving Bagby, now 24, an opportunity. With the help of a black man named Phil Herbert, she sailed north on the Ohio River and into Pennsylvania. Now, Herbert was later investigated by the sheriff of Wheeling, but he feigned ignorance. His silence bought Lucy time, and the Goshorns had not given up the hunt. She ended up in Cleveland, which possessed a strong biracial abolitionist community. And upon arrival, she met with William Ambush, the leader of the Cleveland Fugitive Aid Society and one of the most powerful black men in the city. With his help, she found employment in the household of A.G. Riddle, a radical Republican who had just won election to the House of Representatives. So short of reaching Canada, Bagby really had earned as much security as a self-emancipated slave could achieve. She was in a free state, she had the support of an influential black abolitionist, and she was employed and sheltered by a prominent white politician. And yet it would not be enough. While Bagby enjoyed her brief freedom in the fall and winter of 1860, the nation fell apart during the secession crisis. Lucy's own crisis began a few weeks later. After being free for about 2.5 months, she was now working in the household of a jeweler named Lucius Benton. But her former owner had been informed of her refuge in Cleveland, and under the authority of the Fugitive Slave Act, he obtained a warrant instructing U.S. Marshals to help him retrieve his human property. The raid was scheduled for January 19th, 1861, a Saturday. Before the dawn, Goshorn and the federal agents made their way to Benton's home in the cold darkness. The posse quietly surrounded the house before knocking on the front door. The Bentons were still in bed, but Lucy was already awake, preparing the house for the coming day. One of the deputy marshals later testified in court what happened next. Quote, I was followed by Mr. Goshorn. We rapped twice at the door, and the second time the girl, Lucy, came to the window and lifted the curtain, which she immediately let fall again. Mr. Goshorn passed by the window, and she had, I suppose, recognized him. Now, can you imagine the dread that Lucy must have felt upon lifting that curtain? Her former master and law enforcement on the other side of the glass could only mean one thing, and she ran. The marshals broke down the door, and they chased her upstairs into Benton's bedroom. Lucy clung to the bed frame until the marshals hauled her away. They dragged her out of the house and into a carriage. She had lost her freedom. So her capture quickly grew into a heated political crisis. She had fled Wheeling in October of 1860 when the United States was whole. But by the time she was captured, 5 states were in rebellion. Still, most slave states had yet to declare their loyalties, and no one knew when these dominoes of secession would stop falling. South Carolina's declaration of secession complained of Northern resistance to the Fugitive Slave Act, and so the nation looked to Lucy's capture to see whether the law would be enforced. As Lucy was being transferred from state jail to a federal facility, a group of Black Clevelanders surrounded the caravan. The federal agents had also come in force, anticipating a rescue attempt, and they swore in 55 deputy marshals to transport the captive. The Anti-Slavery Bugle reported that these federal agents freely instigated violence against the Black Clevelanders. They lamented that the officers' quote, chief delight was to get into a fight. And violence followed in the footsteps of the entire Bagby affair. On the day of her trial, fistfights and knife fights broke out between the gathered Black crowd and some white Ohioans. So Cleveland is really on the brink throughout this entire ordeal. Lucy's trial, however, took on a tone of sad inevitability. Her former and future owner, William Goshorn, had the law on his side, if not justice. The Fugitive Slave Act insisted that she was nothing more than lost property, and since Virginia remained part of the Union, Lucy was doomed to return to slavery. William Ambush rallied to her aid once again, vowing to raise money for her freedom, actually double the amount that she had been purchased for originally. But the Goshorns were immensely wealthy, and they had re-enslaved Lucy for political reasons. The presiding judge surmised that, quote, these men, the Goshorns, want to know if the people will enforce the law. They care nothing for the money, end quote. And the Goshorns hinted that they might sell Lucy to abolitionists in the future, but only after they had proved their point and re-enslaved her in Virginia. With her fate sealed, most of the white North breathed a sigh of sad relief. They were glad to have avoided an abolitionist raid. This being Ohio, the Oberlin-Wellington rescue is fresh on everyone's mind. And they're worried about sort of shaking loose more states from the bonds of union. But of course, Lucy's return to slavery did not save the Union. The court handed her over to the Goshorns. The city, again, on the brink of violence, the Goshorns wasted no time in escaping, accompanied by an armed escort. Abolitionists, however, had planned one final rescue attempt, hoping to storm the train at an isolated station. But the conductor saw the crowd gathered and rather than stopping, applied speed and sped through. When the Goshorns reached Wheeling, they threw a dinner party for their armed escort, and to punish Lucy beyond re-enslaving her, they imprisoned her in the Wheeling jail. So that's where we have to leave off Lucy's story, though she would eventually claim a lasting freedom during the Civil War and make a really kind of compelling return to Cleveland as a free woman. But I'd like to analyze the newspaper coverage of her trial, with a particular eye towards how gender shaped their narrative. And one of the most interesting things here is that the mainstream Northern press, they quickly identify Lucy as the victim and the Goshorns as the villain. But the concept of Lucy, this helpless woman tormented by the slave South, is really differentiated from the person of Lucy, a Black woman trying to start a life in Cleveland after enslavement. So let's examine Lucy as a symbol. The Cleveland Daily Leader reported that, quote, much sympathy has been felt for the unfortunate woman who is thus to be taken back to bondage, end quote. And the case received coverage all over the North, where the reaction was usually similar. But this sympathy was for the symbol of Lucy. It was an expression of the white North's frustration at having to appease the slave South again. They chafed at the fugitive slave law because it imposed Southern law on their home soil, much less for how it stole Black people into bondage. This is best demonstrated in a headline that circulated in countless Northern papers, and you can see this in the slideshow. The human sacrifice, Cleveland offers a victim, the Union still unsaved. So from that headline, we can glean that Bagby represented this final gasp of antebellum compromises in hopes of using slavery to hold the Union together, even after it had begun to unravel in earnest. The white North hoped that Lucy's involuntary sacrifice, again, emphasis on involuntary, would demonstrate to the Confederacy how dearly Northerners value the rule of law, even the hated Fugitive Slave Act. As the Cleveland Daily Leader put it, the actions of the people of Cleveland in this case have been expected of a law-abiding community. We have done our share, one that galls us to endure. Will the South do hers? End quote. But there's one more crucial aspect to Lucy as a symbol. The Cleveland Plain Dealer reported that Lucy was expecting a child. but I'm reasonably certain that she was not pregnant. Her pregnancy does not appear in the great majority of newspaper accounts or court records that I've seen, nor was it mentioned in either of the 2 interviews conducted with Lucy in 1861. And many of these sources do explicitly comment on her physical appearance, often in negative ways. I suppose this could simply be a prudish Victorian omission, but given how sensationalized the story was, I think her pregnancy would have been more widely noted. And it makes for a better story. A desperate mother-to-be made the slave South seem all the more barbaric for their northern readers. It was the ultimate trope of gender. And then there were the rumors that she was secretly married to a man in Canada, notably printed in the Liberator. But I think this was also an embellishment. For one, Garrison was mostly reprinting old news from Ohio newspapers, so I don't think he was like that up to date on the case. But more importantly, Lucy stated outright to a reporter that no, she was not married. And she later remarked that she wished she would have gone to Canada if she had known that her freedom would be so fragile in Cleveland. So we can glean from that that she had the possibility to go to Canada and actively chose Cleveland. But in the end, I think this secret marriage, like the pregnancy, was a romantic gendered fiction created by the Northern press. So that's Lucy as a symbol of the secession crisis. Let's look at how the press covered Lucy as a human being, as a Black woman trying to start her life from nothing after slavery. A reporter was granted a brief interview with Lucy while she was held in jail. Frustratingly, the reporter paraphrased nearly the entire interview, obscuring Lucy's voice. This itself a small reminder of how little Northern society valued Black women's opinions. The reporter described her condescendingly as, quote, an ordinary-looking Negro girl, extremely Black and somewhat backward about talking, end quote. Now, he was making a judgment for the simple fact that she was a formerly enslaved woman from Virginia. And while we would take this as a sympathetic fact, the reporter used it to belittle her. He then asked why she fled. In a brief quote, we have a scrap of Lucy's own voice. She fled because, quote, she was not very well treated by Goshorn. What exactly that means remains unknown. So this first interview is dismissive of Lucy herself while still being sympathetic to her victimhood. But the symbol of Lucy as a victim denied the fact that she was brave and resourceful to escape from slavery and start a new life in Cleveland. And also, as far as I can tell, fairly witty. The Cleveland Plain Dealer was granted a second interview, different newspaper, but the second interview she gave with Lucy after the trial, as she was being returned to Virginia and to slavery. Again, it's too brief, but at least we get her voice without paraphrasing. So recall that when she first arrived in Cleveland, she had briefly worked for A.G. Riddle before taking a job with Benton. And the reporter asked her to verify a rumor that was apparently flying around Cleveland, that she had, quote, used 70 pounds of butter in a week in Mr. Riddle's house, implying that she'd been fired for cause. And Lucy replied scornfully, damned lie. We don't actually know why she changed employers, but the reasons were probably mundane. Riddle served as part of Lucy's defense counsel, so he remained on good terms with his former employee. And more to the point, how could anyone use 70 pounds of butter in a week? But this unfounded rumor implies that Lucy was either corrupt or hopelessly careless or just something negative. And it's part of this larger narrative that living in the free North had made Lucy less respectable, less of a lady. This gossipy reporter then asked Lucy if it was true that she never swore until coming to Cleveland. This was apparently another rumor flying around Cleveland. And she replied, that's true, but it's enough to make anyone swear the way they treated one in that damned place, end quote. And it's kind of hard to argue with that. So perhaps there was a grain of truth that she was less ladylike. But what should we expect from her new life as an independent woman with no savings, earning a living through hard manual labor? Maintaining the idealized gender standards for a woman in 1860 took time and money that Lucy simply could not afford, particularly just 2 months after being enslaved. And it was telling that the reporters were so interested in gossip, rather than the questions that we would be interested in asking her. She was caught up in a flashpoint national trial about slavery, as the United States was crumbling because of slavery, and he could find no questions more pressing than her gender. As a symbol, the white North believed that Lucy was part of the price that the Southern states demanded to remain in the Union. They handed her over, but recognized some injustice in it. But she was dehumanized in the process, reduced to a bargaining chip and a one-dimensional victim. As a real person, the North treated her much like any other Black woman, with aspersions about her character mixed with some well-worn tropes of race and gender. I'll have to conclude here. Thank you very much for your time. As you can see in the slideshow, I'm preparing this for an article for journals, and that's one of the reasons I wanted to draw on the expertise of the Midwestern group. So if you have any suggestions, please send them to me via email. Thanks.
Okay, we will do that. Thank you, Daniel. Very interesting. And then moving to our final panelist today, Lucas Bensley is a PhD candidate at Loyola University in Chicago. Excuse me, his research explores urban history, public politics, gender, sexuality, and race in the modern era. His current project that he'll talk about today examines mass leisure and entertainment in the context of burlesque in turn of the century Chicago. So please go ahead, Lucas, hear about it.
Yeah, of course. Thank you so much. And I assume you all can hear me, right? Okay, great. Thank you. So yes, as you see, the title of the work is Daring Dames and Dirty Deeds. It is intended to be a brief history of burlesque in Chicago from 1870 to roughly 1940. So I'll provide a synopsis of what I've been able to find in there in terms of the story, the historical material, and the characters involved. But first, I want to offer a brief word on what the purpose of the study has been, what I hope it contributes to what has already been said on the topic and the broader historiography, as well as a brief word on the methodology behind it. So, as I've already stated, that this is intended to be a brief history of burlesque in Chicago, and I felt compelled to write this because there seems to be a glaring omission in the field. Like, even though a lot of histories have been written on the topic as a broader American cultural phenomenon or as an aspect of national history, not enough historians give Chicago its due in the way that it's influenced burlesque and its many presentations and styles of performance. So I hoped that this study would hope to remedy that absence. Secondly, I hoped that it would serve as a conversation with the many historiographies that are laid out in the biography, how burlesque is a phenomenon of urban history as well as one of gender, sexuality, and cultural production, especially when it comes to mass leisure and entertainment. I believe that the subject has something of interest to bear for all of those fields. And finally, like this work, as long and verbose as it already is, I intend it to be expanded upon as the topic for my dissertation going forward, and to even include an analysis of drag performance in Chicago and the broader history of that as well, and how both drag and burlesque parody and speak to changing norms of gender and sexuality over time, as well as the wrath it incurred in the way of politics of censorship and cultural conservatism. And so then that leads to the necessary question then, what exactly is burlesque? Well, you all may be surprised to learn that it is not all about tassels and fan dances. What that picture of burlesque represents is actually fairly recent generation in the art form, started in the 1930s, and I'll talk about that as we get to it. But since its very beginning, burlesque at its very heart has been a genre of parody, of comedy of sorts, and in the long run, it has served as a form of parody of gender, of sexuality, and of heightened forms and values of beauty and appearance on the stage. But beginning in its earliest days, starting in the 1840s at least, it began as primarily as a form of stage comedy, and it had a lot of roots in American vaudeville and minstrelsy for a number of reasons. It borrowed a lot of performative styles and tropes from both genres, whether it was skit comedy and very bawdy humor and jokes from vaudeville, and from minstrel shows, the use of a lot of musical productions and reviews, as well as, unfortunately, the portrayal of a lot of dated ethnical and racial stereotypes on stage, whether it was blackface, portrayals of European immigrants such as the Irish. Use your imagination, it was probably there. So what about Chicago then? Where exactly does the history begin and where does it go in the story I tell? And I will try to keep the synopsis here brief, so to do justice to the format that we're in. So burlesque in Chicago began roughly around the 1840s, and it was mostly in line with the earliest days of burlesque. As I've hinted at, it was mostly comedic, mostly a focus on skit comedy and, simple parody of other genres, especially genres of art that we might consider to be higher arts, right? Such as ballet, opera, melodramas, and so on. And one of the most successful troupes of this generation of burlesque at this time was this touring company from the United Kingdom, actually, and they were known as Lydia Thompson and the British Blondes. Now, they were famous and somewhat notorious, rather, not just for perfecting that kind of genre of comedic satire and send-ups of everything from ballet to opera, but also because they featured center stage a lot of female dancers in fairly revealing dresses for their time. I mean, shocker, they showed their knees. How dare they for Victorian era theater, right? So as they toured to Chicago in 1870, they received rave reviews from the public and a lot of positive feedback from the mainstream and the theatrical press. However, they did receive one starkly negative review from a journalist, I believe, of the Chicago Tribune. My notes escaped me on that topic. And there was this brief controversial moment where Lydia Thompson herself and some other performers and producers from that, they tracked down that journalist and they actually horsewhipped both him and his wife in the streets of Chicago in 1870. I assume to somehow improve that. I assume that was their way of trying to win the argument that burlesque was a civilized form of entertainment for its time. But nevertheless, they received slap on the wrist. They were let go to much public fanfare of their adoring crowds. Apparently, that was not enough to stymie the success of what was to come. So the next major chapter in Chicago burlesque came with the World's Fair, the Colombian Exposition in 1893, and what was showcased on the Midway grounds over there rather than the main proper fair itself. And one of the most important figures from this time was Little Egypt, a Egyptian belly dancer that is featured on the Midway grounds. It is not known precisely by historians what the real name of Little Egypt was because her title was co-opted by so many performers in her time and not long after. And that's because, well, after that performance at the fair, like belly dancing sparked a sort of cultural mania of sorts in Chicago. Like every burlesque venue, every variety venue in Chicago sought to have a belly dancing act in its lineup because of the obvious attention that it attracted from audiences at the time. I mean, if you thought legless dresses were controversial, this was, belly dancing that was putting female sexuality and sensuality front and center on the stage. But this was not without drawbacks for its time. This was one of many early examples of how stereotyping was not foreign to the burlesque genre. It was very much promoted as Orientalist by its show promoters and by its critics. Even the show promoter at the fair even described the belly dancing exhibit as a, quote, ethnological exhibit of semi-civilized states. And the other somewhat negative long-standing legacy from the role of belly dancing here is that it provoked some of the first conservative cultural backlash against it by the likes of men like Anthony Comstock of the New York Society for the Suppression of Vice. You may know him as a career curmudgeon and very notorious for matters such as this. And he criticized this in the press as, quote, one of the most outrageous assaults on the sacred dignity of womanhood ever endured in this country, unquote. I don't know how he came to that conclusion, but what have you. So with the success of belly dancing in Chicago, it coincided with the expansion of districts of theaters and venues strictly dedicated to burlesque in both South State Street in what is now the Loop District in Chicago, thank you, and West Madison Street, what is now the West Loop, and mostly higher end fine dining in Chicago. Now, these ranged in quality from ones such as the Folly Theater and the Loop area that had like amateur talent nights, really just chorus girls who were employed to encourage patrons to drink, and even chicken throwing contests. I'm not joking, that somehow popped up. So that was one end of the spectrum, and to the other were more regal spaces such as the Star and Garter Theater in what is now the West Loop that really tried to elevate burlesque as a appropriate and respectable genre of theater and entertainment, right? So such as that, their venue had like marble decor, 2,000 leather seats, a parlor room, a smoking room. It was a very proper theater by modern standards. Now, at this time, there was a concern amongst burlesque impresarios and theater runners to try to remedy the reputation of burlesque and to try to regulate the sorts of performances put on the stage at the time, because it was already incurring backlash and even legal problems from the city at this time. In 1908, the Chicago Tribune sparked a lot of investigatory reports on a lot of theaters in the Loop because of the ways in which they charged that it was violating indecency statutes for the kind of performances that were being put on, most especially belly dancing acts and even nude dancing on stage. And indeed, by 1916, there have already been multiple cases in which theater licenses were revoked, and new organizations dedicated to vice were investigating supposed bouts of drug use and quote-unquote white slavery or prostitution that was being allocated for these kinds of venues. And one group that was very much behind these efforts to police burlesque early on was the Juvenile Protective Association, whose papers provided a very unlikely but a very fortunate primary source information for what these shows looked like and where the venues were located, and so on. So then it comes to the late 1920s and early 1930s, where burlesque had been suffering on the back heels for a while due to this backlash from the city and nationwide concerns that they would have to dampen down the naughty nature of burlesque in order to survive. So from this time, we get the unlikely origins of the striptease, and there are many stories by many historians about how this came about, but one story that I'm kind of biased towards is that it came about as a wardrobe malfunction, actually, in this theater in Chicago in 1928. Supposedly got caught on a bit of scenery, the audience lost it, and the producers begged this performer in question to repeat it again and again. And from then on, it took off, and burlesque was never quite the same. Now, it's from this time that burlesque became more alike what we recognize it today, right? Where starlets become like mini celebrities in their own right. They become deemed as like burlesque queens. And with that comes like a bit of higher pay and more status and exposure and more airtime and promotions as well. So you get stars like Ada Leonard and Choreo, whose names still carry currency with burlesque historians today. And with that comes benefits. There are more bookings and more demand for them around, and there's also higher pay. These starlets could make, on average, $100 to even thousands of dollars a week at venues. And consider that adjusted for inflation for its time. That's very decent money. But bear in mind, they are the exception to the rule. So performers that are just starting out, chorus girls, and supporting cast could make as much as like $60 a week. And that's just assuming that the managers don't stiff them on their pay during times of toughness. And if they raise any concerns with their employers, they could always be blacklisted. So it was far from regal. It was still at its heart very much a business at this time. So it is in the 1930s, and I will try to speed to the end, so bear with me. It's in the 1930s that we see the sort of peak in the business and the appearance of burlesque in the cultural zeitgeist for Chicago. And nowhere is that clearer than on the streets, on the fairgrounds of the Century of Progress Fair in 1933 and 1934. Here, most people will well remember Sally Rand for her daring appearances there. There's a worthwhile story here that on actually May 27th of 1933, this very day, back in the day, was the opening night of the Century of Progress Fair, and Sally Rand was not invited to perform. However, she was not to be stiffed on such an invitation, so she crashed the party at what was the Streets of Paris exhibition, where they were premiering the events in her famous Lady of Godiva act, where she appeared on top of a white stallion, completely nude in full costume and the like. It was very daring. So anyways, over the term of that show, and I promise I'm sorry, I'm trying to get to the very end. Over the terms of that show for the next 2 years, Sally Rand and many other burlesque artists of lesser fame took to the streets of the fair in spite of efforts by the mayor's office, by police, organizations by the Juvenile Protective Association, and even lawsuits. Like, these performers still continue to keep performing, and strangely enough, in spite of all the controversy arose to their appearance, no one was arrested. In fact, the only documented arrest at the fair was for a drag performer at the time, which I guess kind of shows the priorities of the city at the time, because the fair was intended to fundraise for the city, and burlesque and the gradual lifting of prohibition was fairly good business for them at the time. And so even Sally Rand was taken to court for supposedly violating indecency statutes, and there was an attempt to put an injunction on her shows. But in a very funny way, the Superior Court judge that was put in charge of this case, he struck down these injunctions against Rand and others, and strictly saying this is not at all the business of the court. And he even goes on to say, lots of people in this community would want to put pants on horses. The fair's visitors are just a lot of boobs to come out to see a woman wiggle with a fan or without fig leaves. But we have the boobs, and we have a right to cater to them. This is a Superior Court judge. I mean, I just want to put that out there.
Good
So,
job, Lucas.
Sorry,
you have one ending sentence you want to leave us with?
Yes, I do. So immediately afterwards, the city cracks down on burlesque venues, and as well as drag venues, and essentially puts them out of business and forces them out of the city for a generation. But I hope the end of the study makes clear that the history of burlesque does not end there. It has ongoing cultural legacies for American culture and for the city of Chicago as well. So
Great.
I'm
That
sorry.
is so fascinating. I mean, we just really don't hear much about these topics, do we? So, I mean, not only is it interesting to me, but I can think of a lot of students who would maybe wake up in history class if these are some of the topics we're covering in our textbook. So well done. You all did great. We do have questions. And our first question is for Anne. There she is. Okay, so Anne, we had a question about had you looked into professional organizations for journalism in your studies of women in press reform movements? And was that a source that informed your research?
I have mainly looked at the Reform Press Association itself. There were usually state organizations, and then there was also a national press organizations. Actually, there was a couple. There was a split in 1896, 1897 between the fusionists and the non-fusionists. So that was reflected in their Reform Press also. So, but I will humbly say that I have a lot of work to do. This was part of my larger dissertation. And I know I need to look at the other wider women's press organizations. I did look a little bit at the early 20th century. Eileen Worth has a book out on women journalists, and Chatty was actually a very prominent member of the Nebraska Press Association, which was by that time not a reform-oriented organization. So, but again, I will say I have a lot of work to do, but my main emphasis has been the reform organizations so far.
Right, great. Thank you for that response. And then we have a question for Daniel. So Daniel, it seems like in your research, you found Cleveland to really be like a key geographic place for abolitionism and also anti-abolitionism. So I was wondering, like, what unique sources did you find specific to Cleveland, and did you encounter like challenges in finding your sources?
Yeah, so this was completely researched during COVID, so everything was online. I would love to get in some archives. So because of that, it was mostly newspapers. But yeah, I found Cleveland very interesting, particularly impressed by this character, William Ambush, who I had to cut mostly out. But he's just kind of everywhere and extremely important. And I know in like, admittedly, a little bit of some dated literature, the abolitionist movement is really sort of portrayed as white, with Black abolitionists kind of being foot soldiers. But it was just such a powerful refutation that he's like writing all of these things in the newspaper. He's organizing Black Cleveland in committee and passing these resolutions. So I'd like to get more into his life because he seems very prolific. But yeah, because of COVID, I haven't been there.
I think we can all commiserate with we can't wait to get back in the archives, definitely. But thank goodness for digitized newspapers, right?
Yes.
It sounds like you have a lot of potential directions to go in. I'm excited to keep following it. So for Lucas, I was wondering, well, first I want to say I appreciated the cultural and interdisciplinary approach of your topic, of your paper, bringing in like the history of parity and transgender studies. I just think is like a great way to look into cultural studies, especially in terms of Victorian era theater and comstockery. So like kind of the same question, what sources were helpful to you, Lucas, and what kind of challenges did you run into in writing your paper?
Yeah, of course. So one of the challenges I have found is that a lot of the performers, the producers involved, they're very itinerant in their nature, right? Because they, burlesque operated as a circuit business back in its day, and performers may even change their stage names multiple times. It can be very hard to track down who they actually are. So the sources that I found most useful and rewarding for this part of the project so far has been like stage and mainstream press in Chicago, as well as the greater country, like the New York Clipper and Variety have also been helpful as well. The records and the papers of the Juvenile Protective Association, who I've already talked about, they've been really good about identifying burlesque venues and theaters back in the day that simply aren't there anymore. All of these spaces have been redeveloped over the years. There are none of those original theaters I've talked about still exist. And aside from that, there have been some very helpful digital historical projects about historical theater in Chicago, and there's already a rich historiography of burlesque by other historians, and their sources and footnotes have also been tremendously helpful, at the very least just to provide a timeline of sorts, because it's very hard to find out like where burlesque rises and falls over time. It's still very much a hard story to tell, but it's very entertaining.
Yeah, I guess by its very nature, right? I thought that was very interesting, and you'll continue to run into those challenges, but I feel confident that you'll overcome them and find creative ways to find your answers. I assume you've read William Cronin's Nature's Metropolis about Chicago. It's kind of a seminal piece, but yeah, good luck with your future research. And then Justin, we have a panelist who would like to know what was an unexpected or surprising moment in your research? And to just build on that, I also wondered if you ran into like a language barrier when you were researching your primary documents.
Oh, thank you. Those are great questions. In terms of the language barrier, no, a lot of these sources are, they come in English. What's fascinating about Chusick and her story is the degree to which it's fundamentally filtered through white settler perspectives. So you have to sort of read these sources very closely. And often, and because of the way in which early 19th century Euro-Americans viewed Indigenous women, a lot of the references to Indigenous women are oblique, especially women like Chusick, who was a scullion maid. She worked in the household. So when she is referred, for example, in the Boyd papers, she's referred to as the Indian woman, or the problematic squaw, but she's never given a name. In fact, I found a reference to her in the John Quincy Adams diaries. He was a voluminous diary writer. Just everything that he did, he put in a book. But he refers to her as the Indian woman from Mackinac who gave me socks, which is interesting, but it shows you the degree to which her story is often mediated by outside voices. What's fascinating about the portrait and about the chapter in McKinney Hall's book is it's a story about a woman whose story probably wouldn't have been remembered or written down or engaged with outside of this very intense partisan politicking under Jackson and Adams. And I think it's been fascinating going through the textual history of this story and trying to figure out why her story was remembered, what purposes her stories were put towards, and why almost as soon as she left Washington, D.C., was she politicized and commercialized to such an intense degree. So it's been a lot of fun kind of digging through the archive and trying to find these spare little fragments of stories about her.
Is Henry Rose Schoolcraft still considered like an essential source for early Native American studies?
Yeah, he's something that I think I have been dealing with his sources a lot. What's really fascinating about people like Cass and Schoolcraft and McKinney, who are stylizing themselves as Indigenous experts and governmental officials, is the degree to which they're not, and there's clearly all these really fascinating gaps, particularly around issues of gender, that they don't consider Indigenous women as worth. Even Schoolcraft, who is married to Jane, who's the daughter of a very important fur trading family. He becomes an expert because he's fundamentally relying upon her intimate knowledge of her family. So he's kind of, taking her expertise and using it to burnish his own reputation. And I think that's what's also fascinating about Chusick, is that her story is designed to make McKinney look good and make the Adams administration look good. And I think this is very true for a lot of these early 19th century white experts, which is a part of the book. What's the consequence of allowing white men to tell Indigenous stories, which is something that I interrogate because as a white dude, it's something I need to consider.
Well, it seems like all four of your papers overlap, and perhaps that's really the main takeaway of our panel on gender, is that historians need to look at how people thought about women and saw women in terms of race and culture and class. And in all four of your presentations, I heard mention of how people are viewing gender and how their ideas or constructs are pretty rigid in a lot of time periods, right? So thank you all. We just have a couple of minutes left before we'll I guess get kicked out of the breakout room. So I just want to encourage you to attend the afternoon plenary, and then we have two more panels this afternoon, and then we'll be wrapping it up. Congratulations to all the prize winners this morning. That was very exciting. I know I've been taking notes over the last 2 days and building my own summer reading list. So attending this conference for me has been like the kickstart I needed to get into my summer research mode now that final grades are in for the spring. Presenters, if you want to look in the chat box, there are some resources, some further questions, suggestions, things like that. So anybody, please feel free to follow up outside of the conference. Okay, and again, thanks so much. I'll see you guys hopefully later today.